Well, I want to first of all say I'm so happy to be here. It's been a great experience. This is a wonderful conference you've organized. In fact, this whole tour of Australia and New Zealand has just been extraordinary, and reminds me so much of what a wonderful country this is, you wonderful people, and how many friends we have down here. Sometimes in North America, it's easy to get preoccupied and realize that there's a whole other part of the world where things are going down, and it's really refreshing and encouraging and hopeful to come here and see what is going on. We are all really part of this global tribe, and we're trying to find solutions and love each other and help each other, and we're trying to build paradigms that will oppose and defeat the death culture that seems to have encircled our planet. Well, I could get on my soapbox for a long time about that, but I think we all are on the same page there. Before I get started, I just wanted to say I wanted to compliment Darpan. I don't know if he's disappeared back into the audience, but here's a guy who's earned his chops honestly, and I just want to give a good hand for him because he's done it. And he's an example for the rest of us, not just in terms of the medicine, but in terms of living your life with consciousness, with intent, with honesty. And his story is just extraordinary. And damn it, he's a real tough act to follow, I'll tell you. But I'm going to try. As most of you probably know, I've completed a book. I've completed a memoir called The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, My Life with Terence McKenna. And it's going to be out real soon. It's gone to the printer, so there'll be print copies around the end of November, and there'll be an ebook up on Amazon and other places probably within about 10 days. We're trying to get it out as fast as we can. So it's all done. It's going to happen. If a lot of you probably in this audience helped support that through Kickstarter and other crowdfunding mechanisms that I exploited, and for that I thank you. For those of you that are supporters, well, just be patient. It's coming. You don't have to go buy it. It'll come. The rest of you, go buy it, please. There's a website. It's not very active right now, but it will be as things ramp up. And if you want to bookmark it and see updates, and it is thebrotherhoodofthescreamingabyss.com. Just you don't want to have to bookmark that more than once. But anyway, that's a place to look, and there's also a thing on Facebook that'll give you some updates too. So tonight, well, as we've been going through this tour, I've been reading some excerpts from my upcoming book, and we settled on one that I read at Melbourne that touched a lot of people, and so it seemed like it was so good that I had to read it at every one. But now there's a lot of people here who've seen the Origins of Consciousness conference or tour. How many people saw parts of that tour? Okay, quite a few, yeah? So now, you guys, I have to come up with something new. I can't just turn over the same old part again. I want to read something new to you. And it's going to be a little more difficult. I've been looking at excerpts. I suppose that most of you are probably familiar with my brother's work. And how many of you have read True Hallucinations? Oh, not so many. Okay. How many of you know about the experiment at La Chirera? Somewhat more. Yeah, okay. Well, this book, among many other things, this memoir is going to be the definitive, final, well, maybe not final, because conversations are never really finished. But it's going to be something official anyway, written down about the experiment at La Chorrera from my perspective, my side of the story, which I've never really told in complete, in some complete narrative. And often, at conferences, I get questions. I mean, people saying, Mr. McKinney, could you tell us about that experiment at La Chorrera thing and what really happened down there, right? Well, I wish I could, but I don't remember a lot of it, frankly. But I remember some of it. So what I'm going to do tonight is give you some never before read excerpts from my book. So you're either, the lucky people or the victims. I'm not sure which. You could be the judge of that. I've got several sections I want to read because the story is kind of complicated and it's hard to just pluck out a paragraph here and there and have it make sense. So if there's time, I'm going to read these several sections that I've got mapped out here. But the good news is I have also picked out several possible stopping places. So, if we reach a stopping place and people are, they want to go on to the next thing or they're pounding on the floor saying, get him off the stage, we can do that. Otherwise, I will plow on. And I'm going to start here with the beginning of chapter 30 of my book, and it's called On the Edge of the Abyss. Maybe I should just say a little something aside about why did I call this the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. Well, the reason is that when we were headed to La Chorrera in 1971 to investigate this phenomenon, we weren't quite sure what it was, but we called our traveling band of seekers the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, kind of in jest. I mean, it was a kind of tongue-in-cheek thing. But at the same time, it was also kind of a serious thing because we knew that we were headed for a great mystery, a great adventure. We didn't know exactly what awaited us, but we had some ideas, and we knew that whatever it was, we knew that it was going to change us, and it was going to change everything forever. And we were right on both counts, but we were not right quite in the way that we believed. So this is from the chapter that is titled On the Edge of the Abyss. In some respects, and I'm just going to read sections and then skip to other sections. In some respects, everything in life before we arrived at La Chorrera was a prelude to the events. Oops, wait a minute, what am I doing here? In some respects, everything in life before we arrived at La Chorrera was a prelude to the events that engulfed us there, and everything afterwards has been a reflection of them. Terence chronicled the events in True Hallucinations. Though his account may seem unlikely and bizarre, I believe it is largely accurate, even if interpretations vary as to what it all meant. I can't vouch for every detail, if only because I was lost in hyperspace for much of the time, or overwhelmed by psychosis, again, depending on interpretation. Anyone with an interest in the facts of our story, if the word even applies, should regard Terence's narrative as required reading. So through a series of decisions before we went to South America, we decided to go to this small mission village in the Colombian Amazon known as La Chorrera. And that was partly because it was the ancestral home of the Witoto people, and they were the makers of this mysterious orally active tryptamine hallucinogen known as ukuhe. So we thought ukuhe would be very interesting. It was a tryptamine-containing unknown drug, and we were very interested in DMT. So that's what led us to go to La Chorrera initially. But when we got there, well, here goes. Mission La Chorrera consisted of a small church with a wooden bell tower, the Padres' residence, a police outpost near the dock on the river, and a cluster of buildings that included classrooms and a few other simple structures. At the end of our trek, we were exhausted and grateful for the chance to hang our hammocks and recover in an empty hut. After a few days, however, the teachers who usually lived there arrived with the bush pilot on his monthly mail drop, and we relocated. The padre, a Capuchin priest by the name of Father Jose Maria, another coincidence in that he had the same initials as our father, Joe Mckenna, let us stay temporarily near the mission in a hut on stilts we quickly dubbed the Knoll House. A number of Watoto families had recently arrived to pick up their children from the mission school at the end of its academic year. In a few days, the padre told us the families would depart and there would be numerous empty dwellings to choose from. We had our eyes on another raised hut off in the forest, but until that opened, we were quite happy where we were. The combination of pastures, cattle, and frequent warm rains had created an ideal habitat for Psilocybe cubensis, the same mushroom species we'd encountered early in Florencia, Porto Leguizamo. These mushrooms are known to be pan-tropical. They occur in both hemispheres, in any place with a warm climate where cattle are raised. In fact, they can be considered symbionts of the cattle, whose dung provides a rich substrate for them. Psilocybe cubensis, then classified as Stropharia cubensis, are the most widespread and common of the tropical psilocybin mushrooms. We found them growing everywhere in the pastures around the Knoll House and beyond. There were big, beautiful clusters of carpophores sprouting out of nearly every cow pat, quite impossible to ignore. Excuse me. We must have arrived at the peak of the season. Earlier in our trip, we'd only spotted a few specimens. Needless to say, we were delighted at this unexpected good fortune. We brought rice, beads, and tinned meats, wrongly assuming we'd be able to purchase other foods along the way. We could buy fruit, eggs, and yucca or manioc root from the locals, and condensed milk and noodles from the tiny tienda at the mission, but our diet was spare and boring. We found that a few mushrooms added to boiled rice or an omelet provided just the thing to perk up an evening's meal. And the best thing was that the after-dinner entertainment was built in. We had not yet understood that the mushrooms were the real secret. We regarded them much too casually as mere recreation. As a result, we found it very easy to eat them daily, either as part of the meal or as a mid-afternoon snack, with no immediate adverse effects. They were an excellent complement to the cannabis, which we smoked constantly, along with the occasional hit derived from shavings taken from our fresh supply of Monasteriopsis caapi, the vine added to ayahuasca as a source of MAO-inhibiting compounds. We found that smoking the bark while on mushrooms synergized the closed-eye hallucinations in a most pleasant and intriguing way. We dubbed this serendipitous discovery vegetable television. It didn't take too many days of such behavior for events to evolve in some fairly peculiar directions. As anyone with experience will tell you, the mushrooms stimulate conversation, and they give one funny ideas that seem to be quite novel, even hilarious. Being constantly on a low dose of mushrooms gave new verbal agility to an already very verbal bunch. Our conversations, full of non sequiturs and amusing puns, flowed freely, much as they had during our first trips at Porto Leguizamo. The difference was that we were more or less remained in the same noetic space all of the time. It was as if our group of five had been joined by an extremely erudite, clever, and delightful guest who had come for dinner and decided to stay. Although we were enthralled by this verbal levity, our exchanges eventually took on a more serious character. Terence recounted the story of a DMT trip he'd shared with an English girl on the rooftops of Kathmandu a year earlier, when all hell had broken loose. They ended up locked in an erotic embrace that transcended normal lovemaking, their bodies seeming to fuse began exuding a violet effervescent fluid that evoked a transformation akin to insect metamorphosis. His improbable tale didn't seem all that far-fetched in the bemushroomed ambience of our little hut. Another idea came up. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. Another idea came up, one tied to a 1968 article by the anthropologist Michael Harner in Natural History magazine. According to Harner, the Shuar people of Ecuador, also known as the Jivaro, regarded the ayahuasca dimension as the real world, and many regularly drank the brew as a way of accessing it. Curiously, upon entering that world, they were often greeted by the sound of rushing water in their heads. The better practitioners knew this to be the realm where their magical abilities could be manifested. One such skill was the ability to regurgitate a brilliant substance, quote unquote, containing magical darts that could be used either to cure illness or to induce it. As I later learned, the concept of a magical substance produced from the body was an element of ayahuasca shamanism throughout the Upper Amazon. In the mestizo ayahuasca tradition, this material was referred to as phlegm, a substance in which virotes, the magical darts, were suspended. This amounted to a kind of psychic technology, like all technology could be used for both good and evil purposes, depending on the practitioner. A more obscure legend had it that these magical fluids could be vomited and speared into a kind of screen akin to a scrying mirror or crystal ball. Master practitioners could gaze into the film and envision the future, see distant places, spot game, and diagnose illnesses, among other feats. The point was that the shamanic phlegm and the violet psychofluid that Terence and his consort exuded in Kathmandu seemed similar. In the alchemical and magical traditions, these objects can be solid, like crystal balls, but they can also take liquid form, as in water or mercury. The unifying concept was that these things were actually a blend of both matter and mind. They were substances, to be sure, but ones in which the future and distant places could be seen, in which anything imaginable, even language itself, literally became visible. Someone unfamiliar with such chatter would have regarded these ideas as extremely odd, if not plain crazy. But as I've described, Terence and I were already steeped in an exotic conceptual stew comprising alchemy, Jungian psychology, ceremonial magic, shamanism, yoga, and science fiction. To some degree, this was also true of our companions. Besides, our analytical categories were pretty loose to begin with. We were anything but rigorous reductionists, even if we might have kidded ourselves that we were scientists. So to us, these ideas weren't that strange. Could the body really produce a substance that was a fusion of matter and mind, and that contained metalinguistic idea complexes that could only be comprehended in a state of profound tryptamine intoxication? We had no problem with that. In our state, that concept made perfect sense. And whatever powers the mushrooms may have given us in the service of great conversation, reductionist rigor and skepticism weren't among them. On the contrary, the mushrooms encouraged the wildest intellectual fantasies, as if egging us on to ever more outlandish scenarios. We heatedly discussed the parallels between alchemical fluids and crystals and shamanic phlegm. We also explored the role played by sound in evoking these phenomena. Anyone who has smoked DMT can testify that sounds heard inside the head are a prominent part of the experience. Sometimes the sounds are like ripping cellophane. Sometimes they are more like electrical sounds, buzzing, popping, and humming noises. Not uncommonly, similar sounds are often heard on high doses of mushrooms. As Terence noted, DMT seems to trigger glossolalia and other forms of spontaneous vocalization. Once the interior sound is perceived, there is an impulse to imitate it with the voice, to sing along with it. The sound doesn't lend itself to imitation, but if one tries, the voice eventually seems to lock on to the inner buzz, which then pours out of one's mouth in a long, powerful ululation that is quite alarming and unlike any sound one would ordinarily utter. and making the sound is cathartic. It triggers an almost orgasmic ecstasy, and it greatly stimulates the closed eyelids visual phenomena. There is a precedent for this in the traditions of ayahuasca shamanism as well. The icaros, the healing songs sung by ayahuasqueros, are used to evoke the inner visions and thereby direct the inner journey. There is apparently a tight link between the icaros and the inner visions and the manifestation of these fluid psychosubstances. Our conversations revolved around these heady ideas night after night as we communed with our new companion. And by then, we did have a sense of being in the presence of an other, an entity of some kind that was fully participating in the conversation, though in a nonverbal or perhaps metalinguistic way. We came to think of this other as the teacher, although it was unclear whether that meant the mushrooms themselves or if the mushrooms provided a channel for communicating with some unidentified entity. Whatever it was, the teacher was full of interesting suggestions about how our investigation should proceed. We began to think pure logos had taken physical form, that is, manifested itself as a substance composed of mind, of language, of meaning itself, yet all somehow grounded in a biological substrate. We used the term translinguistic matter to describe this mysterious substance, and we speculated that somehow it was produced in the peculiar state created by ingesting tryptamines. We figured this matter was psilocybin or DMT that had been, quote, rotated through the fourth dimension so that its trip was on the outside of the molecule. The more we kicked around these concepts, the more excited we became. Now, the reader may wonder what we meant by fourth-dimensionally rotated psilocybin, or a trip being on the outside of a tryptamine molecule. These are strange ideas indeed. An analogy might help me explain them. Consider a piece of sheet music made up of printed notes on a page. The notes are an abstract way of denoting sounds of a particular pitch and duration, played in a particular sequence. The sheet music is a representation of the music, in effect, a schematic diagram of the music, but not music per se. The music manifests itself when the notes are played in a process unfolding through time, the fourth dimension. We can extend this notion to the idea of a molecule like psilocybin or DMT being fourth dimensional. The inert molecule in a bottle on a shelf is something like the 3D score of the molecule's 4D potential. Only when that mundane crystalline substance is combined with a complex mammalian nervous system does the pharmacokinetic symphony, the trip, unfold. The body, in this analogy, is the instrument that plays the trip by metabolizing the molecule. Okay, so let me see. We got that, sort of, but in our defense, if that's what it was, we embraced a conflicting view. We believed an intelligent entity resided in the drug, at least somehow communicated to us through it. Even as we theorized about the 4D expression of the drug, that the trip could somehow be expressed on its exterior by rotation through the fourth dimension, we were assuming on another level that a being of some kind was directing the trip. We weren't the first or last to make that mistake. After all, this is very close to shamanistic views of the psychedelic experience, in which the drug speaks through a skilled practitioner. Though psychedelics have been widespread for decades, people still have a natural tendency to describe their experience as though the trip were in the drug. The LSD gave me wonderful visions, they might say, or ayahuasca showed me, or the mushrooms told me. I'm keenly aware how seductive this assumption is and how easily I slip into it myself, if only as a figure of speech. And yet, as a scientist, I must say, no, these substances did none of these things. The human mind-brain created these experiences. At La Chirera, the psilocybin somehow triggered metabolic processes that caused a part of our brains to be experienced not as part of the self, but as the other, a separate intelligent entity that seemed to be downloading a great many peculiar ideas into our consciousness. Okay, so Yeah. So we devised an experiment, or we were dictated an experiment. We were at this point in thrall of the teacher. The teacher was calling the shots, as it were, and it downloaded through a series of evenings and over time some detailed instructions to carry out what's come to be known as the experiment at La Chouère. But it wasn't really an experiment. It was more like creating a specific setting that enabled some things to unfold that, well, 40 years later, I'm still trying to sort out what it was all about. So we determined to do this experiment, and I'll go on now. On the evening of March 4th, Dave and Vanessa joined us for dinner at the forest retreat, but they wanted no part of our looming adventure. The sudden approach of a violent thunderstorm brought us all outside to stare agog at a massive, flickering cloud. Then the wind and rain hit, and Vanessa slipped on the wet ladder as she hurried back into the raised hut, hurting her ankle. After the storm passed and Dave and Vanessa had departed, Terence, Ev, and I completed the experiment's final preparations, as dictated earlier by the teacher. We knew our success was assured because, thanks to the strange signs we were given as the moment neared, from the intense lightning to the apparent breach of physical law, including the eerie steadiness of a tilted candle's flame, our only light, these phenomena, or so we told ourselves, were caused by the shockwave of the continuum destabilizing events, now just hours ahead, as it rippled back into the past like a kind of temporal echo. We were approaching the singularity. We knew we were going to succeed because, just a few hours ahead, we already had. By then, we'd taken the ayahuasca off the fire and set it aside, along with some bark shavings from the Banisteriopsis vine we'd used to make it. We planned to drink a small cup of the brew when we ate the mushrooms, and, if necessary, smoke the bark to activate and synergize the psilocybin. Earlier, we'd gone to the pasture and located a beautiful specimen of Psilocybe cubensis and carried it back, intact and metabolizing on its cow pie substrate. We had also collected several perfect specimens we'd eat to initiate the experiment. Though we hadn't taken any for a couple of days, the mushroom ESR signal had been more or less audible to me ever since our last major session, when I created the loud buzzing sound for the first time. On the floor of the hut, we drew a circle marked with the 4 cardinal points and placed drawings of the I Ching hexagrams at each one to define and purify the sacred space where the work was to occur. Inside the circle, we placed the mushrooms we'd chosen as our receiving template, along with the ayahuasca and the bark shavings. We suspended the chrysalis of a blue morpho butterfly near the circle, so the metabolizing tryptamine from that source would be present. Why that, of all things? We were attempting a kind of metamorphosis, and so clearly we needed a chrysalis close by. Kneeling together in the circle, each of us drank a small cup of the bitter brew, still slightly warm from its preparation. I munched 2 mushrooms and we climbed into our hammocks to wait. By then, we were fully in the grip of the archetypal forces we'd activated. We were no longer in profane time or profane space. We were at the primordial moment, the first and the last moment of creation. We had moved ourselves to the center of the cosmos, that singularity point at which, as the Hermetic philosophers put it, what is here is everywhere, what is not here is nowhere. We were not in control any longer, if we ever had been. We were acting out our roles in an archetypal drama. Though we were motionless, cocooned in hammocks in a hut in the Amazon, it felt as though we were approaching the edge of an event horizon. We could clearly perceive time dilating as we neared the moment of hypercarbylation, our turn for the act of sonically triggering the 4D transformation of the blended psilocybin and beta-carboline. Time was slowing down, become viscous as molasses as we fought against the temporal gale howling down from the future. A series of discrete energy levels must be broken through in order to bond this thing, I said. It is part mythology, part psychology, part applied physics. Who knows? We will make three attempts before we break out of the experimental mode. Who knew, indeed? We were following a script, but no longer a script we'd written. I ate one more mushroom and settled back into my hammock, wrapped in my poncho-like ruana. It didn't take long before the mushroom's energy began coursing through my body. I could hear the internal ESR tone getting stronger in my head. It had been easy to evoke, never far from perception for the last several days. I was ready to make the first attempt to charge the mushroom template. We'll let Terence take it from there. This is from True Hallucinations. Dennis then sat up in his hammock. I put out the candle, and he sounded his first howl of hypercarbulation. It was mechanical and loud, like a bull roar, and it ended up with a convulsive spasm that traveled through his body and landed him out of his hammock and onto the floor. We lit the candle again, only long enough to determine that everyone wanted to continue, and we agreed that Dennis's next attempt should be made from a sitting position on the floor of the hut. This was done. After a long, whirring yodel ensued, strange and unexpectedly mechanical each time it sounded. I suggested a break before the third attempt. This is Terence talking, but Dennis was quite agitated and eager to bring it through, as he put it. We settled in for the third yell, and when it came, it was like the others, but lasted much longer and became much louder. Like an electric siren wailing over the still jungle night, it went on, and when it finally died away, that too was like the dying away of a siren. Then, in the absolute darkness of our Amazon hut, there was silence, the silence of the transition from one world to another, the silence of the Ganinga Gap, that pivotal, yawning hesitation between one world age and the next of Norse mythology. In that gap came the sound of the cock crowing at the mission. 3 times his call came, clear but from afar, seeming to confirm us as actors on a stage, part of a dramatic contrivance. Dennis had said that if the experiment were successful, the mushroom would be obliterated. The low-temperature phenomena would explode the cellular material, and what would be left would be a standing wave, a violet ring of light the size of the mushroom cap. That would be the holding mode of the lens, or the philosopher's stone, or whatever it was. Then someone would take command of it, whose DNA it was. They would be it. It would be as if one had given birth to one's own soul, one's own DNA, exteriorized in a kind of living fluid made of language. It would be a mind that could be seen and held in one's hand, indestructible. It would be a miniature universe, a monad, a part of space and time that magically has all of space and time condensed in it, including one's own mind, a map of the cosmos so real that somehow it is the cosmos. That was the rabbit he hoped to pull out of his hat that morning. That didn't happen, of course, nor did a new universe emerge from the Ganinga Gap, the mighty gap or abyss or void from which the universe emerged according to Norse legend. The mushroom did not explode in a cloud of ice crystals as its DNA radically cooled, leaving a softly glowing lens-shaped hologram humming a few inches above the floor of the hut. That did not happen because it could not happen. Such an event would have violated the laws of physics. That didn't bother us in the least. We were convinced we were about to overturn the constraints of conventional physics. Besides, we'd been getting feedback from the future. We knew that we were going to succeed because we already had. Yet what I had confidently predicted didn't occur. What did? Terence again. Dennis leaned forward toward the still whole mushroom standing in the raised experiment area. Look! As I followed his gaze, he raised his arm, and across the fully expanded cap of the mushroom, fell the shadow of his Ruana. Clearly, but only for a moment, as the shadow bisected the glowing mushroom cap, I saw not a mature mushroom, but a planet, the Earth, lustrous and alive, blue and tan and dazzling white. It is our world. Dennis's voice was full of unfathomable emotions. I could only nod. I could not understand, but I saw it clearly, although my vision was only a thing of the moment. We have succeeded, Dennis proclaimed. Succeeded at what? Not what I had predicted, but clearly something had happened. For one thing, I think we painted ourselves into a metaphysical corner. What I had predicted would happen could not happen, but we already knew that something would happen because it already had. I realize this statement suggests a misunderstanding of the nature of time, because how can something that was still in the future have already happened? Nevertheless, this is what we understood. So now, let me see here. So that's kind of at the end, and now I want to go to read part of chapter 34, Reflections on La Chirera, that tries to unpack some of this weirdness. Are you still with me, or you want me to stop? Okay, all right, I'll go on. I'm sorry my voice is giving out here, and I have not rehearsed this section at all, so this is live and unrehearsed. But this is from chapter 34, Reflections on La Chirera. The months leading up to our descent into the abyss, followed by the months we spent stumbling out, defined a crucial period in our lives. The two brothers who found themselves in Berkeley in April 1971 were not the same people who shoved off from Porto Leguizamo in early February, so fired with dreams and delusions. Now that I have finished my narrative of that pivotal epoch, I want to step back and attempt a reflection on those events from a distance of 41 years. First, I must admit it is somewhat disturbing that to the extent that we are known to a wider world, it is because of events that played out when we were still achingly young. Though most of my life has occurred after our trip to La Chirera, the years since then have been haunted by its shadow, and I believe the same was true for Terence while he was alive. We went on to pursue careers and raise families, to write books and conduct research, to travel and teach in our efforts to make our mark in the world. We kept plugging away at the mystery, though without the energy or recklessness that fueled our original quest. Nevertheless, the unsettling fact is that what will be remembered for, if we're remembered at all, is an episode of aberrant behavior that others might have tried to expunge from their life stories. Whatever our separate accomplishments, they are modest indeed compared to what we hoped to accomplish at La Chirera, which was nothing less than to trigger an end to history, throw open the gates of a paradise out of time, and invite humanity to walk in. You can't get more ambitious than that. But what was it that led us to form the wild ambition in the first place? Megalomaniacal obsessions rarely rise to such a level, and they're generally diagnosed as pathology when they do, to be treated with medication and even physical restraint. Whether by cleverness or luck, we got to act on our obsessions to an appalling degree. And yet, looking back on that interlude, I have to wonder, was there more to it than mere pathological delusion? Were any of the apparent paranormal phenomena real, that is, objectively verifiable? Who was the teacher, and why were its lessons such a strain on credulity, and yet so insistent? Subsequent analysis has shown many of our ideas to be outlandish and implausible, but not all of them. A few appear to have been gems of actual insight. For example, research has shown that Tryptamines and beta-carbolines, among other compounds, can intercalate into DNA, at least in the test tube. And while no one has proven that DNA and other macromolecules might behave like superconductors under certain conditions, the concept has not been disproven, let alone entirely dismissed. Both issues have been taken seriously in the years since La Chirera, though neither was even suspected before then. For example, on DNA as a superconductor, see Lachimo and Sullivan and Kazuma. Yeah. Oh, what are you doing?
I'm just moving a little bit away from you.
Okay.
Keep hopping a bit.
Yeah. As for Terence's time wave, it may not be an accurate map of time, much less a tool for predicting some final event, but it does embody genuine insights, including his discovery of an ancient calendrical function to the I Ching that modern scholars had apparently not detected. Like the Book of Changes, the time wave may be a useful divinatory tool in itself, if one is willing to see divination as basically the discernment of correspondences between inner and outer states. In that sense, the time wave works, much as astrology and other such methods works. Just don't expect scientific proof or quantifiable verification. When I reflect on what led us to undertake our quixotic journey, I'm led back to the years in Berkeley and Boulder when we first encountered and puzzled over DMT. As I've suggested, this substance wasn't just the most astonishing drug we'd ever encountered, it was the most astonishing thing. And as such, it was surely worthy of investigation. Given our intellectual path until that point, it wasn't in us to say, oh, that's interesting, and then move on. A major reason for our fascination could be attributed to our lifelong immersion in science fiction, aliens, other dimensions, and related topics. As Terence frequently put it, the DMT experience, as Terence eloquently put it, the DMT experience is an audience with the alien nuncio. Taken under the right circumstances, high doses, darkness, and paying close attention, DMT and psilocybin seem to emerge straight from a mashup of Arthur C. Clarke and Philip K. Dick. One sees cartoon-like, multicolored 3D visions urgently presented by elfish or clownish beings who may seem amusing, but who, it is clear, desperately want the viewer to understand what is being presented. Whether one is seeing architectures or landscapes or machines or organisms is not entirely clear. The visions partake of the quality of all of these and more, but what they are exactly remains inexplicable. What is clear is that they are fascinating to contemplate, and their contemplation evokes ecstasy. Terence and I were convinced that DMT had some connection to aliens long before we ever considered going to La Chirera. We thought that DMT bore a message of some kind, either from another dimension or another civilization elsewhere in our universe. Is it possible that we were right? I still believe it might be so. Most sober discussions about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or SETI, presume that contact with aliens will first occur via radio signals we'll eventually detect if we build ever better radio telescopes and search many bandwidths in all parts of the sky. Any other interpretation or scenario is immediately dismissed. For example, what about the notion that crop circles are messages from alien intelligences? This isn't seriously discussed, yet crop circles remain a real mystery, a phenomenon that certainly appears to be the handiwork of intelligence, even if we have to have no other clue as to what they actually mean. And I'm sorry, but to explain away crop circles as hoaxes perpetrated by midnight revelers after the pubs close doesn't stand up to scrutiny. That may be true of the crudest and smallest examples, but the gigantic, geometrically complex circles that appear overnight are not the work of drunken hooligans stumbling about in the dark. So in crop circles, we have solid, physical evidence of a phenomenon that indubitably exists, that is completely beyond human understanding and abilities, and almost certainly originates from a non-human intelligence. And yet the response of the, quote, respectable SETI community is a big ho-hum. Crop circles do not sit well with their assumptions that extraterrestrial contact, if and when it comes, will arrive in the form of an electromagnetic signal visible to our detectors. This notion seems almost laughably absurd. A galaxy-spanning civilization, tens or even millions of years ahead of our own, is not going to use a crude 19th century invention like a radio transmitter to contact us. Such pedestrian thinking is the reason why conventional approaches to SETI are doomed to fail. They are pre-programmed to focus on a single technology that most technological civilizations will have only utilized for a tiny fraction of their history, if at all. Signs of alien intelligence that fall outside this model are ignored. Any civilization that wants to communicate with us or wants us to be aware of its existence is apt to proceed cautiously and use unanticipated means to make contact. Considered in this light, the notion that DMT, psilocybin, and the other psychoactive tryptamines are the calling cards of an advanced civilization is not so far-fetched. This explanation certainly seems to be the message that many people take away from their experiences with high doses of DMT or mushrooms. It was the message that was downloaded to us at La Chirera in 1971 and regularly reaffirmed in subsequent encounters. One important difference between then and now is that many more people have taken mushrooms and to a lesser extent DMT. What's more, growing numbers have shared the sense of alien contact. The sci-fi tinged ideations, the quasi-technical quality of the bizarre machine-like objects that we first experienced at La Chirera and many times since. The consensus suggests that these ideas are intrinsic to the experience rather than to the personalities of two nerdy brothers. People who have never heard of us, who aren't even science fiction enthusiasts, nevertheless commonly report experiences permeated with a sense of the alien other. Such reports have even entered into the scientific literature, as in the experiences documented by Rick Strassman in his FDA-approved study using high doses of pure injected DMT. Many of the experiences reported by his subjects bear an uncanny resemblance to classic descriptions of UFO close encounters, even to the extent of being enclosed in a dome-like space, surrounded by seen or sensed alien entities, and undergoing a medical examination of some kind. As Strassman recounts in his 2001 book, DMT, The Spirit Molecule, these stories were impossible to stuff into any kind of explanatory framework acceptable to conventional science. Quote, I chose to disregard reports I had heard about contacts with beings on DMT and was unprepared for dealing with their frequency in our work, he writes. That and other factors, including the inadequacies of the biomedical model upon which he'd been required to conduct his study, eventually led him to discontinue it and return his clinical grade DMT to the granting agency. Okay. So here we have a phenomenon. There exists in nature a family of related metabolites widespread in plants, fungi, even in animals, including ourselves, that are close chemical relatives of the oldest known neurotransmitter, serotonin, and that are 2 or 3 trivial biosynthetic steps away from tryptophan, an amino acid found in all earthly organisms. When these metabolites are consumed by a certain class of omnivorous primates with complex nervous systems and hypertrophied cerebral cortices, the substances regularly, though not always, reveal the existence of what appear to be other dimensions or other places, objects and images like nothing seen in ordinary waking consciousness. The substances, once ingested, are often associated with a sense of the presence of other entities or some kind of other entities or forms of consciousness, which commonly seem to be proffering a message or lesson of some kind, or at least suggesting that the aforementioned big brain primate pay attention and get it. Moreover, there is often a good deal of congruency between what is seen and experienced by different individuals, though the experiences are difficult to articulate. There is enough similarity that those who have had such experiences can share information and make sense to each other, though not necessarily to those who have not had those experiences. They have a quality of consensual reality that is at least as clear and communicable as most experiences of ordinary reality. So what is going on? Possibility number one is that there actually are other dimensions, parallel realities that these substances render accessible by temporarily altering our neurochemistry and perceptual apparatus. According to this model, there really are entities that want to communicate with us, or at least don't spurn communication when we poke our heads into their dimension. This is very close to the understanding of reality that prevails in most shamanic worldviews. Possibility number two is the more parsimonious explanation, but it is almost as bizarre. For some reason, our brains have evolved the innate capability to generate three-dimensional visions of indescribable complexity and beauty, and that in psilocybin or other tryptamine states are presented to our inner perception, accompanied by a sense of great emotional and intellectual import, and often seem to be narrated by a helpful entity or entities that are perceived as distinct from the self. Whether the first or second postulate is true, the conclusions from either are rather earth-shattering. If the first is true, then we are forced to reject, or at least radically revise, everything we think we know about reality. It makes our current models hopelessly obsolete and incomplete. All of human knowledge, all of our science and religion must be re-examined in the light of the understanding that our cosmic neighborhood just over there is of a completely different ontological order, and moreover an order that is inhabited by entities as intelligent as we are, or many times more intelligent, but that share with us the quality of consciousness, of mindedness, and they are entities that want to share their reality with us, their wisdom and knowledge, perhaps even form a symbiotic partnership or some sort of diplomatic relationship. Whatever they are, they do not seem to be hostile, and they appear to take a compassionate interest in our species, much as an adult might want to love and nurture a child. On the other hand, if the second case is true, then the question stares us in the face. Why? Why in the course of neural evolutionary history has the brain developed the neural architecture and systems to sustain such experiences? What is the point of it all? Perhaps it is a side effect of the evolutionary effects that resulted in cognition, language, and our ability to discern meaning in abstractions and symbols. For years, I've argued in lectures and writings that psychedelics, probably mushrooms, accidentally or deliberately ingested by early primates, triggered synesthetic experiences that formed the critical foundations of human language and cognition, the association of inherently meaningless sounds or images with inherently meaningful symbols and ideas. Spoken or written language is a synesthetic activity that takes place effortlessly and automatically in the process of understanding the language. In speaking, the vocal apparatus produces small mouth noises, small puffs or explosions of air that are inherently meaningless. But because we have learned the language, we all participate in the consensus that certain meaningless noises are associated with inner, visualized images or symbols that, as cognitive constructs, are imbued with meaning. These images and symbols, seen by the mind's eye and associated with symbolic input, supply the meaning to various vocal expressions. In reading, the process is similar, except that a written symbol or word evokes an inner perception of the sound that is associated with the written word or symbol, and this, in turn, evokes an inner visualization of the meaningful symbol or word associated with that sound. Is this not also synesthesia? While language is an extragenomic technology for storing and sharing accumulated knowledge, an enormously large portion of the human neural architecture is devoted to speaking and comprehending it. At some point in our evolution, At some point in our evolution, there must have been a feedback between the acquisition and practice of language that resulted in a relatively rapid change in primate brain structures over a few 100,000 years. Perhaps the epigenetic effect transmitted through the maternal line is transmitted through the maternal line. The consequences are seen in the rapid emergence and spread of civilization and technologies that started about 100,000 years ago and has been accelerating ever since. Having now literally wrapped the globe in our externalized nervous systems, we are nearing a moment when we'll find ourselves constantly embedded in an ever-expanding totality of human knowledge. To a large extent, this has already occurred. Nature, the biosphere, is now encased within the cybersphere, and though the current instantiation is somewhat crude, made of machines and fiber optic networks and satellites and electromagnetic signals, I think that will probably change very soon. As new biotechnologies and nanotechnologies emerge, we will reintegrate our externalized neural networks, and they will again disappear back into our bodies. The boundaries between bio and techno will dissolve, and we will become a new type of human. Individual nodes in a globe-spanning neural network, in a globe-spanning mycelial network. We will still be humans, but not the same humans that first chipped stone axes on the Serengeti plains and gazed up at the stars and wondered. At that point, just as our ancestors did, we will again stand on a threshold in our evolutionary odyssey, ready to emerge from the earthly chrysalis and begin our diaspora to the stars. If humanity is to have a destiny beyond the current dreary prospect of proliferating population and the increasingly rapid strangulation of our planetary life support systems, this must surely be it. It is a mythos built into the human imagination. It is what psychedelics have been telling us is our destiny ever since the first mushroom was tasted by the first curious primate. To embrace this destiny may be the only way we can traverse the cultural, environmental, and economic narrow passage that we are now confronting. This passage is literally the birth canal leading to a new age, beyond history, beyond death, beyond time. Thank you. Sorry for stumbling through that, but there. So, what's our time frame here? It is almost an hour. Said I had an hour. Anyone have questions? Questions, comments?
How about some questions? Anybody? How about a round of applause at least?
Stunned. Well, thank you for listening.
Anything? In there? Hold on, brother. Where are you? Going towards the... Hold on.
Yeah, there's no point to ask the question if I can't hear it.
Hold on. Just talking back here.
In chapter 34, you mentioned that about 100,000 years ago there was some sort of industrialization. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Well, about 100,000 years ago, more or less. I mean, industrialization in the form of, stone chipping, arrowheads and spear points and all that had gone on for some time before that. But 100,000 years ago, something took place, which I am arguing is the emergence of cognition in the human species. 100,000 years ago, the human brain was neurologically modern, but we hadn't yet learned how to use the software. And the mushroom synesthesia experience made the critical connection between the perceived, the heard sound and the meaningful image or symbol, which is, what I'm arguing is that synesthesia, where you can see sounds. Basically, mushrooms, psychedelics readily do this. You can translate one sensory modality into another, and this is the basis of cognition, of understanding. And what happened 100,000 years ago is that we suddenly, suddenly on those timescales over a period of some thousands of years, we learned this trick. And once we had learned to develop complex language and developed methodologies, technologies essentially, which first took the form of oral histories, we developed a means to store the gnosis of a civilization or of a culture and transmit it not only down through time, through these oral histories, through these stories and myths, but also across geographical spaces. And so that language became the first technology, in a sense, that led to all of the types of information technologies that we now have. Once we could share this sort of informational space based on synesthesia, once we had learned this skill that the mushrooms taught us, culture overtook evolution, in a sense. We invented culture. Culture rides on language, and culture accelerates much more rapidly than does evolution through biological means. So about 100,000 years ago began this process that started this accelerating development of culture. So at first it started out slow, but by 30, 40,000 years ago, it was getting rolling, as you can see by the explosion of artistic expression all over the world. Then the psychedelic plants were quickly, psychedelic cultures sprang up in all parts of the world, which we can again confirm through iconography, through their depictions of these plants and the implements that they use to take them. And then it just kept accelerating and accelerating, so that the psychedelic sort of rediscovery or instantiation of psychedelics into culture took place somewhere between about 70,000 years ago to maybe 5,000 years ago, maybe slightly more recently. But by that time, culture was accelerating. So 5,000 years from now, we've gone from, nomadic agriculture, nomadic hunter-gatherer types existence to sedentary agricultural type existences. Now our culture entirely depends on technology, and we've gone, in a mere 5,000 years, we've gone from, primitive agriculture to building starships, or at least thinking about that. So there's been this tremendous acceleration in what you might call the cognitive evolution of the human species. And that's what I mean, not so much the industrialization. I mean, industrialization has had its, excuse me, it's had, obviously, many adverse impacts on the planet. The proliferation of population, the exploitation of resources, and all that. But we have to understand, we have to take a longer-term perspective on those events, I think. We have to understand this is a narrow passage. We will get through it. It's a bottleneck. It's a mere, we will get through it. And the pressures, the evolutionary pressures created by the current planetary crisis that we're facing is what will push us through it. That's the meaning of selective pressure, in a sense. Except in this sense, it's not so much a biological selective pressure as it is a cultural and cognitive selective pressure. Everyone is talking about the shift in consciousness that 2012 is going to bring. Well, it's not pegged to a particular moment or a particular year, but we are all in this process now, and you only have to look around you to see it's happening. I mean, things are getting, I don't think there's anyone in this audience that would disagree, things are getting weirder and weirder and weirder, and how much weirdness can we take before we break through into some sort of new ontological place? So our task is to to the extent that we can, try to direct that, because the dangers are great. The chances are of going off track, are many. But coalescences of consciousness, such as we see happening all over the world, and I do think that these hallucinogenic plants, especially ayahuasca and mushrooms, are I'm a scientist, but I'm also, a philosopher, a believer, a dreamer, a hoper. And my own personal feeling is that, Gaia does have a kind of cosmic, a kind of, terrestrial intelligence. And she is putting forth these plants as tools so that we can learn more, as they have always taught us. But they can, now they come again and they say, okay, monkeys, the next step is you have to get through this, this fossil fuel thing. You have to, get past that. You have to reintegrate with the earth and learn, to live with nature and not outside of it. So we have all of these challenges, and civilizations have always lived on the edge of disaster. Every culture, I'm sure, believes that they live at the end of the world. Their world is about to end. And they're right. Our world is about to end. So in that sense, the 2012 apocalyptarians are correct, but not in the way that they might think. I don't think it will be, I hope it isn't, a global disaster. I think it will be some sort of ever-accelerating, rapid evolution of human consciousness on a planetary scale to, get us ready for the next step, whatever that might be. And when it comes, we'll know what that step is. So that's what I hope for. Other ideas, questions, comments? All right, well, that wraps it up.
That's it? All right, let's give. Thanks, Dennis.
Thank you.